Thank you very much. So I get really, really nervous at these talks. I was just telling them how my hands sweat. It's the only time my palms sweat. If I could learn how to harness this skill, I could be a superhero. But one of the ways that I like to kind of get through these nerves is a friend of mine named Dr. Rodney Herring had once told me, I asked him for some advice on how to give good presentations because I love the way he gave presentations. He's a Seneca researcher up at Roswell Cancer Center in Buffalo. And he told me, have some jokes ready and prepare some stories. And so I do have a story for you today. It's a little hard to make jokes about ethics, but I have some in there. But the story that I did want to start and tell you with today is about this necklace. This necklace my mother gave me at my master's degree graduation, and she was so happy to give it to me. But it does represent something for me that I think speaks to a distinction between Navajo culture and other cultures as they exist. But she gave this necklace to me, and she was so proud to have found it at a pawn shop in Gallup. And she handed it to me, and I know that pawn shops have a different connotation for other cultures, but for Navajos, the buying and selling and trading and pawning of turquoise is part of our economy and has been for quite a while. And I kind of recognized the beauty in it when she handed me this necklace and she said, I want you to wear it when you give talks because I just want you to know that there's some Navajo grandma and grandpa up there looking down at you, so proud of you that you're wearing this necklace. And what that tells me is that this necklace also has a life. And it's really interesting to think about after I'm long gone, there's hopefully going to be some other Navajo presenting to a group like you, and I'll be the Navajo grandpa looking down, being so proud of this person changing the world. And so, not that I changed the world, but I do like to share that really sweet memory with you, and I'm pretty sure my mom's watching. Hi, Mama. And so she's going to really love that story. So I'll go ahead and get started. I also practiced this earlier today and I went a little too quickly, and so I'm going to vamp for time here and there, which means I'm going to go off script, which can be very, very dangerous. She nake dene nishleh bilagana bashashin tatnasani dashache bilagana dashanoli. Justin Lund yinishe akot ego dene nishleh. Yat a, my friends, and hello. My name is Dr. Justin Lund. And along with that story, I do like introducing myself in Navajo, even to non-Navajo groups, because number one, it is an important cultural protocol that we have in identifying ourselves. But I also heard once somebody very succinctly say that it does create a Navajo space for us to all reside in while I talk, and welcome you to my Navajo perspective and in a safe space that we can all be comfortable in. I am a molecular anthropologist and an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation. I like to dabble in Southwest archaeology. That's me there in Northwest Mexico a few years ago. And I find great joy in doing science outreach. This here is me at a Oklahoma residential school that was being rebranded as an Oklahoma School for Gifted Natives. I had a lot of fun that day. So I find great joy in doing science outreach. In fact, community engagement is at the core of my work. By that, I mean that my brand of anthropology starts with an understanding that I will empower and uplift tribal sovereignty. For those of you familiar with anthropology, you'll know that this has not always been the case. My career and my Native identity intersect constantly and probably inevitably. You'd be surprised at how much work could benefit from a Native voice, but there's just so much work to do and not enough of us to do it. And so I find that I am truly a jack of all trades and a master of none. I suppose the PhD might speak to the fact that I mastered one or two trades, but all that is to say, I do love what I do, and I do love the breadth of how I get to share my work. I especially love that during my short career, I've seen some very promising changes in our society that I believe means that we're on the right track to a bright future. This is one of those progressive changes. Only a few years ago, land acknowledgements were unheard of or limited to academic audiences. To acknowledge land, people, and histories in a public setting like this is not common practice in the US. However, it is common practice in many other places and settings. I will read with you. The Flagstaff Festival of Science recognizes that and appreciates that we gather on the lands of Indigenous communities of Northern Arizona. We honor the sovereign nations that behold these lands and mountains as sacred and whose commitments to them continue to this day. As we join together to share and seek knowledge at festival events, we acknowledge the first people who have been practicing science here since time immemorial and respect their contributions to the sacred understanding of our world. We honor the Indigenous people who past, present, and future on the land, who have past, present, and future on the land and in our communities. Our aim is to build positive relationships, understand each other genuinely, and challenge the effects of colonization. I love these land acknowledgements because they really give me an opportunity to talk about something that's so important to everything that I do in the field. I'd like to point your attention to sovereign nations. Sorry, I'm all shaky, you can tell. Over the years, I've found that unless you're native or work closely with native communities, most people don't have a great understanding of sovereignty, particularly tribal sovereignty. Tribal sovereignty is written into the federal structure of the United States, and it allows tribal nations to freely govern themselves and make decisions that support their citizens. But unfortunately, where research is concerned, tribal sovereignty is looked upon as an obstacle or often overlooked altogether. I can tell you now that tribal sovereignty is the takeaway from this entire discussion today. How is it challenged? How is it uplifted? These are the things that I want you to be thinking about as I'm talking about some of the events that we're going to discuss today. Tribal sovereignty must be uplifted, empowered, and asserted to continue to build strong relationships. In fact, it's Osage anthropologist Gene Dennison who has said that sovereignty is the best of all available tools for securing a strong future for the Osage Nation. I choose to think that Dr. Dennison would extend this quote to all nations, and so I took that liberty. You can't think about DNA research and ethical practices in the US without also considering tribal sovereignty. Today, I'm going to share with you some pivotal moments that contribute to the discussion around DNA and ethics in the US, starting way back in 1953. While biological inheritance and DNA had been a topic of discussion for a century prior, it was 1953 when these men, James Watson and Francis Crick, assisted Dr. Rosalind Franklin in discovering the structure of DNA. Now, in my notes, I have hold for laughter because that's a joke. It's a nerd joke. That there was a nerd joke. It's funny because the fact of the matter is that these men have become known over time as having stolen credit from Ms. Franklin. And ultimately, she spent her entire life never receiving recognition for this amazing discovery. Haha, funny joke, right? Now you know how my personality is. However, I'm relaying to you the importance of this discovery. The unlocking of the secrets of life on Earth was encapsulated in this moment. That's a very powerful thing and makes perfect sense why these men felt the need to steal credit for the power. Knowledge is truly power, and genomics knowledge is no exception. 1953 marks one of the first times that a harm was done in the name of genomics. Moving on to 1984. 1984, just a quick 30 years into the future, and we find the first successful sequencing of ancient DNA by this horse here. Just kidding. At this point in time, fresh or modern DNA was becoming relatively easy to access and study. DNA is abundant in freshly collected samples. It hasn't had time to degrade. Ancient DNA, that is DNA that is very old, degraded, or likely contaminated by handling through time, was very difficult to isolate at this time. In 1984, a success was made in extracting and sequencing the DNA from a quagga, a relative to the zebra that had been extinct since the 19th century. Now, I'm not sure how they did ancient DNA studies in 1984, but I've heard stories and they're wild. But today, we find greater success using strict clean room methods in a facility much like the one seen here on the right. This is the Lamammer Laboratories. It stands for the Laboratories of Molecular Anthropology and Microbiome work. This is where I did my PhD work at the University of Oklahoma. And here is a picture of my friend, Dr. Rita Austin, and myself suiting up to extract DNA from the dental plaque of individuals who had passed over 1,000 years ago. And so with these clean rooms, we're ultimately protecting the DNA from ourselves. We are disgusting creatures who are sloughing off DNA with every movement. And so these very rare samples have to be protected at all costs. And so what you're seeing over here, this beautiful blue, is not how we actually do work. Those are UV lights that are cleaning and breaking down some of the DNA that we might be sloughing off in that room. And so that's why we must dress like that. Ancient DNA studies have great potential to expand upon the fields of archaeology, anthropology, paleontology, evolutionary biology, and perhaps most importantly, conservation. Skipping forward just a few years, in these two case studies, that involve the collection of modern DNA samples from living people, we can find some significant missteps and some unfortunate results. These two events are commonly referred to as the Nu-Chah-Nulth incident and the Havasupai case. Myself and others choose not to continue to frame these cases in this way, bringing attention to the tribes, but rather I call them the University of British Columbia and the Arizona State University debacles. I like that word debacle. It seems like a really good one. In 1986, a researcher named Rick Ward at the University of British Columbia collected 882 blood samples from a small tribe called the Nu-Chah-Nulth. The consent agreement was that with the people was that the samples would be used to study the high levels of rheumatoid arthritis suffered within the community. That project was never completed. Yet, the samples traveled with Rick Ward as he gained new academic positions in the US and the UK. Countless secondary studies were conducted using these samples, and the Nu-Chah-Nulth were not informed and had not consented. It took years for these harms to come to light. Now, can you imagine someone doing DNA studies on you and your family or your community without your consent? It's really, really unheard of. Well, the Havasupai can. The Havasupai can. The picture on the right is of Havasupai elders praying over samples of their people from a similar case in 1989. The Havasupai wanted to collaborate with Arizona State researchers to understand their high levels of type 2 diabetes. In a dramatic turn of events, a Havasupai member was on campus at ASU for a presentation on her tribe's DNA, where she learned that the DNA was used to study human migrations, inbreeding, and mental illness, all things that were explicitly not consented for. These two case studies represent significant challenges to tribal sovereignty, and they begin to frame the ethics of indigenous genomics in the US. On to 1990, maybe. In 1990, we find a remarkable movement forward for Native peoples and their histories. This is not specific to DNA, but the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, a federal mandate, is put forward to repatriate to tribes sacred and funerary objects and human remains that have been held by museums and academic institutions as collections. NAGPRA is not without its flaws, but continues to be a meaningful step forward towards mending centuries-old relationships. NAGPRA can be a powerful tool for understanding tribal relations and tribal sovereignty. though we'll take a tiny skip forward to 1996 and find that these two cases that I'm about to share with you involved ancient DNA. And they both happened in 1996. Some of you might be aware of Kennewick Man, or the Ancient One. He got a lot of press back in the late 90s. He gets his name from where he was discovered in Kennewick, Washington. A nearly complete human skeleton was exposed and unearthed due to some erosion. The remains were dated to be nearly 9,000 years old. And an unfortunate initial forensic analysis determined in error that the skull resembled a European type. In popular media, the erroneous assumptions were exacerbated when people saw similarities between the Ancient One and television sweetheart Sir Patrick Stewart. The narratives were taken up again by leaders of white supremacy groups in support of an ancient white nation in the US. Ultimately, though, through eventual DNA analysis, it was proved that the Ancient One was closely related to Native American groups that still exist today in North and South America. Despite NAGPRA, indigenous claims to these remains became a murky and contested discussion right until the DNA analysis were complete. Despite sovereignty and a federal mandate, Native people and their place as indigenous to this continent was challenged simply with these remains. And though those narratives have been proven false, the stories linger today as conspiracy theory. In contrast, and at the same time, in the same year, we have the case of a man ahead of us, or Shukaka. Shukaka was discovered in a site called On Your Knees Cave, which I have pictured for you here. The cave opening became visible in 1993, and the remains were discovered within in 1996, along with animal bones and stone tools. Shukaka is dated to have been alive 10,000 years ago. These researchers, on the other hand, immediately partnered and collaborated with local Alaska Native communities. They worked together to build an understanding of man ahead of us, and he was quickly reburied in a secret location with appropriate cultural rites. It's interesting to see the contrast between these two case studies. One required litigation. Now, fast forwarding to 2002, possibly. Because of these very complicated events, and no doubt others, the Navajo Nation implemented a moratorium on genetics research. A moratorium is a legal ban on an activity for a temporary period of time. Many other Native nations followed suit and implemented strict policies against research to prevent potential harms to their citizens. It's been nearly 25 years now, and this discussion is beginning to advance on the Navajo Nation and elsewhere. Not directly part of the Navajo Nation discussion, but the group that I work with back in Oklahoma called the Center for the Ethics of Indigenous Genomics Research. We have gone out into quite a few communities to discuss what culturally relevant research policies might look like. And we find a variety of ideas about how genomics can benefit or harm communities. And so all I have to say about that is that there are 574 federally recognized nations, and there should be about 574 unique genomics or research policies. And this is going to take time for all of the reasons that I'm telling you here today. But as we approach 2016, we see that there's still a ways to go. This event wasn't just a debacle, it was a fiasco. In 2016, these researchers on the top publication published an analysis they conducted on remains that had been collected from Chaco Canyon in the late 1800s. The remains had been housed at the American Museum of Natural History, who also gave the permission for this destructive analysis. There are, in fact, several communities who descend from the Chaco Canyon people, and despite NAGPRA, the work was done without consultation or collaboration. This work immediately complicated relationships between archaeologists and community members, Native communities, and genomicists and Native communities. In fact, I was doing work in the field in 2016 and that summer, and it was all we could talk about how we were going to repair the relationships that these researchers damaged. None of these researchers are welcome back to the Southwest, and no apology has ever been made. However, it did spur a new vigor into ethical conversations with what I'm sharing with you down there. And some Native researchers and allies were able to put forth ethical frameworks that have been lacking before. And so here, this image from this paper attempts to show the connectedness of these concepts and practices as ethical, with sovereignty and research regulation smack in the middle, community engagement on the outside, and these really important concepts of equity, respect, beneficence, reciprocity, being the spokes that pull together transparency, capacity building, dissemination, and cultural competency. And we arrive now to today. So what might the solution be? Your guess is as good as mine. We're still working through this. One of the ways I kind of define ethics is as a discussion. It's an ongoing conversation. It's not the rules of anything. These discussions continue to advance as technologies continue to advance. You might be surprised to know that only 1/3 of 1% of people in the US are Native and hold a PhD. And that is an incredibly small number. That has to change. Remember old crusty ASU and their debacle? Well, looky here. They are actively working to change things. And so we have Crystal Sosi has become their first Indigenous genomicist, opening up a lab in these past couple of years there at ASU. Her lab will center an Indigenous perspective and train Indigenous students. And she's bound to do amazing things. She's a good friend of mine. There's also Native Biodata Consortium in Lakota country. They're the first research center and biorepository situated on tribal land, specifically under tribal jurisdiction, something that's also never happened before. And don't forget about little old me. I was asked to explain why there's a poop emoji there, and the reason is because there's an actual poop under there. The work that I do is microbiome work, and to access the microbes in and around our body, one of the ways we do that is through fecal matter. And so I've done you the favor of covering it up for you. Anyway, now NAU also has its first Indigenous genomicist. Oops, sorry about that. We are in the process of making space for the Lund lab. My lab will probably focus primarily on microbiome work. Microbiome work, while still has the potential to have ethical implications, seems to be a little bit more accessible because I am accessing microbes that live on our human bodies rather than our actual human DNA itself. Now, there's going to be ethical discussions that come up about that kind of research, but we're happy to do that here in this space. We are renovating these three rooms in what's called Building 49 at NAU, where we now have a biological anthropology station. Dr. Karina Kellner, who will be giving a talk later this week, has this space over here where she does isotopes work. And so we're hoping to really build a biological anthropology program here at NAU that's sensitive to these kinds of issues, and I think that this is the right place to do that with the right student population. And I'm happy to report that the Anthro Lab building is getting a makeover to house my lab, which will explore Indigenous issues from an Indigenous perspective in hopes of training Indigenous students. The hope is that these labs are a safe space. These labs represent safe spaces to explore Indigenous genomics while continuing to uplift tribal sovereignty. And I want to leave you again with this beautiful quote about how sovereignty truly is one of the best tools towards very strong futures and relationships for us all. Thank you very much. You guys have been a great audience, and I'm happy to take questions.
We're open for questions. I just want to remind you, Justin, because of our viewers online, if we take a question from our in-person audience, can you repeat it
For
so that
sure.
we can hear it?
For sure, for sure. Yes, sir.
DNA decay rate. I have a physics, mathematics background, and also know that radioactive isotopes have definite time you can say because anyway, how long they decay is exactly fine. I hear constantly or read constantly about articles that date DNA changes because so far back in the past. Anyway, if the DNA sample was held in environmentally controlled conditions, and I realize that would be the issue, you can't tell whether it's too hot. Anyway, what is kind of the decay rate? Years, decades?
There is calculations for this. Generally anything old that is a valuable sample, we treat like ancient DNA. So anything over 50 years old, if it's been in the sun, if it hasn't had environmentally controlled conditions, but generally 50 years is that breaking point of what we determine as ancient DNA. But it kind of depends on the sample. It depends on the sample. It depends on a few variables, because you might have a bone that's been left out in the sun for 10 years. That would be very difficult to extract DNA from, and we would want to use ancient DNA methods for that. And so it is a little bit variable. There is some math, as I was preparing for this, there is some math to it, but those other variables probably outweigh the math considerably. You would really have to have those controlled for, and that's impossible in some ways. And I saw a question back there. Yes.
All right, let me get you on this. There are a lot of other sites around the world of people finding old remains and such that don't have big whooplas about the whole thing, and they're sort of excited to look at it, and they're anxious to find the results and such. My question is, do you think that perhaps the issue of only 1/3, 1% of Native Americans being educated like that is perhaps part of the reason why there's so much hesitancy and superstition, but beliefs of, hey, you can't touch this, instead of looking at, hey, what can it tell us about migration, our history and everything, and being more excited about learning about this and opening it all up?
Yeah, no. So the question is there excitement about these kinds of events, or is there issues with the fact that there's not a lot of excited anthropologists to be doing this kind of work? And that, again, is a complicated answer. As I told you, I have been in multiple communities, and we have a range of views towards the benefits of genomics. And so it might be a misconception to think that all Native people don't want to do this, but many Native nations are very wary about how sovereignty can be challenged through these kinds of projects, through the kinds of narratives that can be created from these projects, and the way that the public takes hold of these narratives and runs.
Negative.
Mhm.
But now we mentioned sovereignty claims.
Yeah. For example, you would want to always be partnering with the communities that you're working with. Nobody wants stories told about them.
Okay, so sovereignty over their nation rather than sovereignty over their land, because they find, oh, this isn't even a relative of ours here.
They can all be very nuancedly connected. And so these kinds of challenges, they do represent diminishing acts towards sovereignty. Ultimately, we would always want to partner with our Native neighbors and make sure that we're collaborating to do these kind of works, because anthropology has a long history of telling stories about Native people, but not with Native people. And that presents the biggest issue of it all. And these stories then do challenge sovereignty in different ways. With Kennewick Man, these stories of a white nation, an ancient white nation here, those really, really complicate things for different tribal communities in those areas. And we don't want to do that. We want to all uplift each other together. And that's not something we have done.
So on that goes before us ban, whatever, were those remains studied to determine, yes,
Yeah.
they are actually
Yes.
related to us, so therefore we do have the right to go there.
Yes. And so these are all you're getting at something really important to all of this is that even within what we think of as objective knowledge, there's still politics deeply entwined into our knowledge creation processes. And you're also right in that we do need more Native people to be doing this so that we have this excitement to find out about our human history together and that it doesn't complicate anybody's political standing within this country. Thank you.
Or relationships, I guess. There are things about that and become educated, white man educated, I guess you could say, that that person won't be so accepted by.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely that concern. I, as a researcher with a PhD, I'm an outsider now. And I have to respect that. And so I don't just go into my community and collect samples or do archaeology. I have to live up to a professional code of ethics, the same that everybody else does. And yes, that does put me as an outsider, but it also creates a bridge. And it wasn't something that I had planned with my career, but here we are. And so I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to do it. And I was really excited to come back here to Flagstaff for this opportunity to be close to my nation as well as other related nations to be doing this kind of work. Awesome. Thank you for those questions. Yes, sir.
So from what I've heard, it seems like it's not just Indigenous people that have problems with the DNA being used for other things. Are there other people you can partner with or learn from how they handle things like that, or kind of move forward so that as a general, DNA is not used when you're not supposed to use it?
You know, there's like I was saying, there's going to be 574 different partnerships that represent different cultural values. One of the communities that we went into in Oklahoma, they have a very strong medical facility and research system, and they were excited by the opportunity that genetics presented. But in other communities that we've been in, these hesitations based off of these kinds of events and others remain. And so it's a matter of me getting out there, you guys getting out there, and kind of talking about these things as equals. This is a great opportunity to share some of these things. Ethics is a boring conversation, and when DNA and science are involved, it becomes even more boring. And so I'm super excited that we are all coming together and having this conversation, because it does show that there's some interest in all of us uplifting each other together and finding these human stories out, and how they relate to each other and how we all relate to each other. Brandon.
I have a question.
Okay.
Ryan asked about the recent actions using the pandemic to collect a lot of DNA. If there's any, it's known that that's been seen by other nations as a possible activity that they could pursue.
Okay, the question is about China collecting, using the pandemic to collect DNA without their citizens' consent. And that brings me back to this definition that I tried to push out there about ethics, that it is an ongoing discussion. It changes as you go across international boundaries. And so you can kind of see that in just that I'm talking about native nations. But I can tell you that the way that I do archaeology here in the Southwest is very different when I cross the southern border into Mexico. The methods that we use, the way that we handle the artifacts and who we give the artifacts to. And so this question about China represents something similar, and that China has their own codes of ethics for how they do their work. Yes, we can judge them from over here as much as we want. However, the type of research that they do and how they do it would fall under their ethical guidelines, and that conversation is something we should have over there, more so than over here. But thank you for that question, Brian. That's a great one. Yes, sir.
This is absolutely wrong. To say science and ethics are boring.
Nice. I'm with my people then. The comment was, this is the wrong audience to say science and ethics was boring, and I'm super happy about that. So thank you. This is a great opportunity to kind of share what I do and feel appreciated. So I thank you for that. Yes. Ah, I'm so glad you asked me. So I have been trained on ancient microbiomes, modern microbiomes. The gut and the oral microbiome are really easy to access through feces and saliva. One of the things that isn't easy to access as far as microbiomes go is the lung microbiome. And this presents a really interesting opportunity to connect what I do and indigenous methodologies, because some people don't know that Navajos have a different perception of health and well-being, traditional different perception of health and well-being that's more connected to what we call our wind waves, so like our breath. And I see a really good opportunity to connect lung microbiome science to an indigenous methodology of learning about those kinds of microbes that are in our breath and how they impact our health. Now, the reason why this kind of work hasn't been done is because lung microbiome sampling is incredibly invasive. And so people usually are going in for a treatment or some sort of other medical experience when we get these samples, and we have to figure out a better way to access the lung microbiome. And so that's kind of one of the things that I want to explore here, both making the lung microbiome more accessible to research, healthy lung microbiomes, but as well connecting to this Navajo way of understanding our body that's very traditional. And it might lead to some really informative ways that we understand the way our bodies work together, more so than just sampling blood and spit and feces. Yes. Oh, for sure. We could talk about this all day. Yes, so so we well, there are these ecosystems of microbes that live all over the place, and we have collections of them on our human bodies. And so some people estimate that if we were to take them all and weigh them, they would weigh, I think, estimates of like 7 pounds on any one person. Now, if we were to sterilize ourselves and get rid of all of these microbes, we wouldn't be able to survive very long either. So they're doing an amazing thing for our body in that they're helping us digest food, they're helping us stay healthy in a variety of ways. But these microbes is a really interesting way of understanding the world that is a transition from when we understood the world as germs. And so now we're starting to understand that there are germs out there that are incredibly harmful, but there's still millions upon millions of microbes that are incredibly helpful to biology and the human experience. And so this speaks to another native way of understanding that there's a world of the unseen that is impacting our health. And so there's other native scientists who have kind of used microbiomes as this bridge to talk about the world of the unseen and how it impacts us. Of course, of course. Yes, sir.
How far back are you talking about?
Oh man, you can go really far back. So the plaque that builds up in our teeth, for sure. We're talking about ancient microbiomes and how far we can go back looking at the microbes of individuals long since past. And there's a variety of ways. Well, there's 2 main ways, really. One is through the plaque that builds up in our teeth over time. And so we all tend to go to dentists and get that cleaned off. People in the past didn't. And so it builds up kind of like tree rings and presents a perfectly encased microbial sample from a person's lifetime. So we get a good representation of the oral microbiome that way. And sometimes, depending on circumstances, feces that's left behind in certain areas, if it is desiccated in the perfect circumstance with the perfect environmental conditions, we can access gut microbiomes from ancient people. We have thousands of years, thousands and thousands of years. Yeah, the microbes, and it's interesting to see how people's oral microbiomes have changed and how they relate to other primate species. These kinds of things are helping us understand the evolution of the microbiome as well. alongside us. Awesome. Yes.
Wondering if in general, review boards or do it like a DNA study or
Mhm.
something, if they are supposed to be, limit what they can use anybody's sample for.
So we have what's called IRBs, institutional review boards that exist in nearly every university and hospital to govern this type of research. We're starting to get tribal IRBs. And so the Navajo Nation has a fairly sophisticated review board, but there's not a lot of tribal IRBs across the nation. And so we are dependent on the universities having this extensive knowledge about tribal histories and how science can impact them. And we don't all have the same collection of knowledges. And so sometimes things get through the cracks. Most of the time they don't. In Oklahoma, the University of Oklahoma defers to the tribal IRBs. And so a lot won't get through. But we're at a time where we are hyper vigilant about protecting people from harms. And we're going into a new time where we're discussing how we can be less hyper vigilant and more inclusive of each other as we continue forward to understand how we all relate to each other without reproducing these kinds of harms that have been done in the past.
We do have
Awesome.
first, talking about Lund, the Navajo descend from Denisovans. Tibetans have a Denisovan mutation that allows them to breathe more easily at high altitude.
I am not aware of Navajo descending from Denisovans, but I am aware of the discussion around Denisovans and high altitude adaptation, and that's really, really fascinating. I wouldn't be able to do it justice here, but just to tell you that there are some humans who have an adaptation to high altitude in certain parts of the world, I believe in Tibetan areas as well as Peru. And it's a fascinating adaptation that humans have that elaborates a lot on the plasticity of the human body. And now we're starting to learn that it's possibly through Denisovan DNA that we do have this adaptation. But we're still learning more about that as time goes on. And so Denisovans are these human ancestors that have recently been discovered. And were discovered primarily through genomics. They found them through a finger bone that was already in the collections of a museum that they did genomics on and discovered that it was significantly derived from the species that they thought it was. And so that's how we come to know the Denisovans. Let's see, D-E-N, then O-S-A-V-A-N. And they're very interesting. There's a lot of really new hominin species that are coming to light. There's a really great Netflix show that just came on about a cave called Rising Star Cave that you can watch and learn a little bit about some of our more recent ancestors.
One more question. Do you have a story you can share about what you found? Perhaps coupled to community, surprising, or just?
Kathy has the question about a story I can share about a community we found that's surprising. I think with the work that we did in Oklahoma, we were all surprised that this particular nation, and you can look up some of this research by searching my name and find out this exact community. I didn't really get permission to talk about them directly, but this is published work, so you could definitely find it. But with their medical center, with their medical research center, they were so well positioned to take up this question of what does genomics look like for us? And it was fascinating to watch these discussions quickly evolve into how do we benefit from this? How can we capitalize on this resource the same way that other communities do? And so we were very surprised by that because the common assumption is that Native communities are against this kind of research, that we don't want to do it, and that these moratoriums represent a complete ban across all Native nations. And ultimately, it just represents we need to pause, we need to break, we need to figure some stuff out. And this group of this native community was ready to get going with that. And so that was one of the most interesting things we found.
We have time for about one more question in the audience, and then after that, if you want to stay and answer questions, we'll set up.
For sure, for sure. Yes, sir. Uh-huh.
You were talking about microbiomes.
Yeah.
I was being studied some of the ancient people.
Yeah.
Do you know, are you aware of the study along those lines of the Iceman, the so-called Iceman?
Oh, Etsy the Iceman. I'm not aware of any microbiome studies that are being conducted on him. It would take a quick Google search to figure it out, because I imagine for sure, yes, because those remains are perfectly preserved. And so that the likelihood of getting the gut microbiome from the Iceman is great. And so those gut microbiomes from ancient remains tend to be kind of finicky. Those would be a pretty good representation. I would be surprised if they haven't already done a few preliminary studies on those remains. But thank you for that question.